Welcome to Talking Beats with Daniel Lalchuk. That's me, and I'm so glad you're here. If you like what we do, I'd love it if you gave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if you're so compelled, write a review. That really helps, and maybe tell a friend or family member. They might like the show as much as you do. If you want to get involved in the program, visit our website, talkingbeats.com, and click Support the Show, where you can make either a one-time or a recurring donation. As we look to continue having cliche-free conversations of real substance with a diverse range of the world's most compelling people, your support is so appreciated, especially as we look to expand and increase our offerings. If you have a question, comment, or thought, find us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or if you wish to reach out directly, email me at daniel@talkingbeats.com. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get on with today's conversation. On today's program, botanist, scientist Cassandra Quave. She's the herbarium curator and professor of dermatology and human health at Emory University. Her recent book, called The Plant Hunter, A Scientist's Quest for Nature's Next Medicines, really caught my mind because she's asking questions that we all probably wonder about now and then. What can plants do for us, do for our health, for our well-being that we don't know about? Plants are the basis for an array of medicines we all now take for granted. As the writer explains, if you've ever taken an aspirin, thank a willow tree for that. But in today's world of synthetic pharmaceuticals, scientists and lay people alike have lost the connection to the natural world. Cassandra Quave argues that we ignore the potential of medicinal plants and we lose out on the opportunity to discover new life-saving medicines. Thought-provoking stuff indeed. I couldn't be happier to welcome her. Dr. Cassandra Quave. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
Holding the book right here, The Plant Hunter, A Scientist's Quest for Nature's Next Medicines. You're the plant hunter. Why? What is it about plants?
Yeah, I mean, I was always one of those kids that was barefoot, running around outside and climbing trees. I was a bit of a hellion as a little girl, always in the dirt. And I actually started my fascination with medicinal plants quite young. In all of my escapades, I, got scratched up and even burned building bonfires and things like that. And so I started using aloe from a local plant we had grown in our yard in Florida to kind of treat my wounds from a young age. So I guess you could say, yeah, I've been really engaged with plants for a long time.
Aloe is something that a lot of people are familiar with. I remember, of course, as a kid, you get a burn and someone says, oh, there's a aloe vera, aloe vera plant over there. You can break off the leaf and it has these amazing healing powers. That's a fairly common thing. What did you discover as a kid about plants that goes beyond sort of aloe vera and the things that a lot of people would know about? I mean, when did you start to realize that, wow, this is a whole world. It's not just things to look at or things to climb in or things that can scratch me. This is a rich world of potentially untapped benefit.
I really didn't have that aha moment until I was in college. I was long fascinated with nature. I spent a ton of time as a kid outdoors, surrounded by nature, exploring forests. Ironically, my dad is actually in the land clearing business for agriculture. So I would be out in the woods with him as he's pushing trees down. And as those trees were felled, I'd look into all the different epiphytes that were on the branches and just kind of exploring and observing things. But really, from childhood, I always thought I was destined to become a doctor because I was so surrounded by medicine growing up. I was born with multiple congenital defects of my skeletal system, which required the amputation of my leg at the age of 3, which then led to a hospital-acquired infection and scores of other surgeries over the years to try and help correct some of the issues that I had with my spine and my hip and leg. And so I was always fascinated with medicine because those were my heroes, my doctors that took care of me, I really looked up to. But I still had that love for nature. And it wasn't until, I guess, my junior year of college, I was studying, I was a pre-med student studying anthropology and biology in addition to my normal pre-med load with lots of chemistry classes and things like that. And it was then that I came across this term ethnobotany, which I'd never heard of before. I mean, to be honest, I'd never even heard of anthropology before I went to college. And so when ethnobotany kind of came across in my course learning materials, it really kind of showed me that, aha, maybe this is a way to unite the things that fascinate me in medicine and my fascination with nature. Because ethnobotany is the scientific study of how people relate to plants, and that can include everything from their interest in plants for traditional medicine or for food or for tools or all kinds of different uses of plants.
There's a dictionary definition of ethnobotany, and you just touched on your own definition. The one of the dictionary goes like this: the scientific study of the traditional knowledge and customs of a people concerning plants and their medical, religious, and other uses. There's a whole other emotional layer here that goes even beyond or even intersects in different ways with the pure math and science of all this.
Yeah, I mean, I think ethnobotany is really the window through which we see our world. It's been described also as the science of survival. I mean, it's amazing as a species, all of the different habitats that we are able to inhabit across the globe, all the different climatic conditions, temperatures, availability of water, the different plant and animal life around us. And really, it's that those generations of human knowledge that have been passed down from grandparent to grandchild and mother to daughter over millennia that has fostered this rich set of knowledge that allows us to really not only survive but also thrive in so many different environments. I think for me, ethnobotany and really, it's a way of really helping me understand my place in the world, right? Because when I'm out on a hike and I'm looking at the wildlife, it sounds strange, but it's almost like, encountering an old friend when you see a species that you recognize and that you can name, and that's a plant that someone uses to treat coughs, or here's another plant that we can forage and eat. It just really makes, I think, our connectivity to the earth so much richer.
We think of East and West a lot. In my field in music, I travel all over the world playing concerts, East, West, North, South, everything in between. I look at colleagues in Asia, colleagues in Europe, and we think of Western medicine, Eastern medicine. I think a stereotype, although maybe not a stereotype, certainly partially true, is plants are used more in the East, at least have been traditionally, than they have been in the West, or certainly are now. Is there a bias, do you think, against the use of plants for medical ailments? And as an extension from that, how useful can plants be?
Those are great questions. I mean, I think it's important to really position this with this idea that, as I mentioned, humans have lived in all kinds of different habitats all across the globe, and they use their knowledge of nature to survive. And you see this within their systems of traditional medicine. No matter where you go in the world, there has been a system of traditional medicine that has been primarily based on plants. In fact, billions of people today, especially in the developing world, still rely on plants as their primary form of medicine. So if we get sick and have a headache, maybe we go to the pharmacy and pick up some pills, some aspirin or Tylenol. But in many traditional cultures, they might go to a bark of a tree and make a tea of that and consume it. So there is this idea that traditional medicine is only practiced in Asia is absolutely not true. It's still practiced all across the globe. It is practiced in different forms all across the globe as well.
You can understand why I would say that, because I think it's a popular it's a popular conception, maybe myth, but if it is a myth, then dispel that myth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think well, for one thing, it's much more mainstream. If we think about traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or Unani medicine or traditional Tibetan medicine, those schools of thought, those kind of bodies of medicine that are taught to students are really part of mainstream medicine in an institutional way. in many of these countries. Whereas if you look at, shamanic healing in the Amazon, there's not necessarily going to be a large school dedicated to this. It's really reliant more on the apprenticeship process of a healer teaching one or a very few number of apprentices in their lifetime and then carrying on that knowledge that way. So a lot of it is around, how that knowledge is shared, if it's shared in an institutional type of format, and how well integrated it is into the mainstream medicine of those countries. Most traditional medicine doesn't rely on a traditional healer. In fact, it's often knowledge that's held by women that are heads of household or the elder women in the household, so grandmothers in multi-generational family homes or mothers that have this knowledge built over time from their experiences and from learning from others about which types of herbs can be used to treat a lot of these kind of minor day-to-day complaints, scratches, sore throats, children that are anxious, any of these kind of things that we might go, again, to the pharmacy to fix, but instead they're relying on plants they find around their village in nearby forest. There's also this misconception, I think, that a lot of people have that medicinal plants are going to be the most rare, precious orchid found in the forest canopy that's so difficult to access, when in reality, a lot of the medicinal plants that are used on a day-to-day basis are those that can be found growing around the home. They're found in hedgerows or kind of disturbed soil plots alongside of agricultural fields, or they're found in other natural habitats and then collected and dried and stored for use throughout the year.
Can you give some examples? I'm up in New Hampshire right now. It's not particularly warm, not particularly humid. If you're down in Georgia, it's a very different climate over there at Emory. So rural New England, right now it's about 62 degrees out, sunny, quite cool. Mm-hmm. It goes down to the low 50s at night now. What's growing around here that we can use other than aloe vera and maybe some herbs? I think I got the last of my basil last night, but that's only going to cure a gustatory ailment that needs curing. No, not a medical one.
Well, it depends on the type of basil. So one of my favorite medicinal plants is a species of basil that is known as Ocimum sanctum. It's holy basil, also known as tulsi, which is really important in Ayurvedic medicine. It's an adaptogen, and I actually grow it in my garden. So you could probably easily grow it up there as well. And it makes a really lovely tea, either fresh or dried. I mean, there are a lot of members of the mint family that you can find, are easy to cultivate in a garden or even in pots on your balcony if you live in an apartment or a condo. I'm a big fan of peppermint for upset stomachs. Ginger, of course, is really nice. You can find that in any store. And then there are things that you can find, I'm sure, in New Hampshire, like rose hips when it's the season for them, or plantain. And I'm not talking about the plantain that looks like a banana, but actually it's a little herb that's Plantago is the genus. And that can be used in salves or to, kind of chew on and apply to insect stings. I was actually stung by a wasp once on a hike in Scotland, and my fingers started to swell up, and I found some plantain, chewed it, and put it on there, and it kind of helped with the stinging and the swelling.
Spell that. I have the luxury of being at a computer. I typed in Plantago. Oh, yeah. I think I recognize this, but how do you spell?
Plantago, it's Plantago.
Yeah, so I'm looking at, I think I recognize this. It grows low to the ground.
Exactly.
Can you describe it? It's beautiful sort of oval green leaves.
Yeah, it has these beautiful, now there's different species. So some plantain has very long, skinny, narrow leaves, and those are known as Plantago lanceolata. And those are used in different, in Europe in particular, to treat wounds that are bleeding. So it helps to stop bleeding. The plantain that you're talking about, that's kind of a rounded leaf that has 5 veins, is that one's good for, as I mentioned, making nice salves where you can basically steep the leaves in olive oil and then let that soak for a while, and then mix it with some beeswax over a double boiler and make this kind of soft salve that's good for the skin. Or in a pinch, like I mentioned, you can pick it up and kind of crush it up, chew on it a little bit in your mouth, and then stick it onto an insect sting. So there's, there are medicines all around us. And this is one of the reasons that I really love teaching, because so many of my students have what we would call plant awareness disparity, which is basically an unawareness of the things that are all around them. It's kind of like if you can imagine looking at a beautiful picturesque meadow, or even taking a walk on a wooded path wherever you live. And at first, that path or that meadow just kind of looks like an innocuous state of green. Maybe you can recognize a few trees, but really, you're not seeing anything familiar. And what's amazing about teaching people about how to recognize plants and how to really understand the value they bring to their own lives is that instead of being in a strange land, when you're looking at these landscapes, all of a sudden it's like they have a whole bunch of friends there to greet them. And there's just this excitement of being able to see and recognize and know all of these different values that these species bring to their lives and to others. And, if you ever go on a hike with a group of botanists, count on the hike taking about 5 times as long as it normally would and not moving very far, because we're always stopping and bending over and, getting into the grass and looking at things that we come across as we go.
To put it bluntly, what is it like to go on a hike, which you do a lot of, and there's a lot of pictures of you online out in nature, intrepid explorer, with one prosthetic leg?
Yeah, that's kind of the hiccup in the plan, right? I love being outdoors, but there are some challenges. I think that as with all things in life, good planning can go a long way. One of my biggest challenges with today's prosthetics, and I'm really so very fortunate that we do have more advanced prosthetics. I've been an amputee now for 40 years. That's going to date me. But, I've really seen the evolution of prosthetics since the early 1980s, and it's just been amazing. My first legs were very heavy. They had these bulky straps, and that would just rub my skin raw. They had socks that you would wear over the stump, kind of like cloth socks. And being a kid that loved to be outdoors, I was often sweaty, covered in dirt, and subjecting my leg to a lot of friction. And so that's a recipe, for sweat, friction, and dirt is a recipe for skin infections. And in fact, I dealt with a lot of recurrent infections as a kid because of that. As an adult, the prosthetics are just, it's just a night and day difference. I have a lock pin mechanism now, which keeps my leg from flying off. Actually, as a kid, losing my leg in flight was actually a big problem. If I was running. Yeah.
You mean literally it could come off?
It could literally fly off and did a lot.
And then you'd go toppling down to the ground, I assume.
Yeah, although I did have wickedly good balance on one leg. So if you can imagine me running across the playground and it flies off and, sometimes knocking into other kids, and it was heavy. It could hurt. It was a challenge. I think the funniest one was, I grew up in a very small town. And so when the local fair came to town, that was just, the event of the year. We had the swing rides and little roller coasters and things from the county fair. And I remember in high school, once I was on, the swing that kind of spins you around in a big circle and it gets bigger, higher and higher. Well, I was on that and my leg shot off from the ride.
Wow.
Luckily, it didn't hit anybody. It kind of landed in the grass, like far away. One of my friends had to go find it for me. But yeah, so today, luckily, there's no flying legs because I have this great lock pin mechanism that keeps it on snugly. So that at least is a challenge I don't have to deal with in the field. But, the friction is still an issue and sweating is still an issue when you're out, especially in the Amazon. That was a big challenge for me, even using, the most superpowered deodorants you can possibly imagine that are available under prescription. To put those onto the stump, it still would just make it, I just get so sweaty. And so there's a constant stopping process where I have to stop and pat dry the leg and pat dry the inside of the stump liner, which are now made of this kind of malleable material. It's almost like a silicone, kind of a soft, squishy material. So it's very gentle on the skin, which is wonderful. But there's nowhere for the sweat to go. So my hikes are slow. I have to stop and dry off. And, my leg gets tired. I'm not just an amputee. I've also had, a lot of other bone issues. I have hip dysplasia on my right side. My right femur was actually several inches too short. And so as a kid, they had to lengthen the bones. They cut it in half and lengthened it. So the bone's a bit weaker on that side. And I have scoliosis. So I'm all lopsided, basically. So when I'm hiking, I have to take my time. And if it's a really rigorous climb, that's when things get a bit more challenging. And that's where I get creative, find some donkeys to use for getting up those steep areas, or horseback. If it's by water, using canoes or airboats or whatever can get to me to where I need to go.
Well, it's inspiring to have you sort of out there dealing with all these issues that most people don't need to deal with, or don't even think about dealing with. But here you are. I hope I get the chance to go hiking with you sometime. Where do you like to go? Are there you talk about, well, you travel a lot in this book. Actually, it's part travelogue, but around your base, which is in Emory in Georgia. Are there hills? Are there trails?
Yeah, well, there's some just beautiful places. Atlanta is in a great position because, with a short drive, you can really get up into the mountains, and we have some beautiful state parks. We also have some places that are really nice that are close to town. I love visiting Arabia Mountain Nature Preserve. It's a granite rock outcrop reserve, and so you have some really interesting threatened species that occur there. And it's almost like certain times of year, it's like you're walking on a moonscape. It's kind of this, you feel like you're walking on the moon. And then other times of year, you have these amazing pools, these little shallow rock pools that just fill with bright and colorful species that are just fascinating to look at. So we do that a lot. And I'm a big fan of state parks. I think we, like to go to Sweetwater Creek Park as well. So I think there are a lot of opportunities no matter where you live. There's been a term called micro adventures of ways to really engage with things that are local. You don't have to fly across the world to engage with nature. You can find a lot of great opportunities, in your neighborhood. Or even in your backyard, even if it's something as simple as getting out your sleeping bag and, sleeping in your yard for the night, just to get that connection to the earth and to be able to hear those sounds of the insects and animals at night.
Well, that's something we did sometimes as kids. It's great. Put out the sleeping bag in the backyard. I grew up in rural New Hampshire. There's a lot of backyard and a lot of wildlife, and see what you hear, see what you observe. Dr. Cassandra Quave, talk about this character in the book here that you clearly have deep adoration for. This is Don Antonio, the medicine man. Tell us about this interesting individual who inspires you.
Yeah, Don Antonio, he is a traditional healer. He was a traditional healer that really began his training in shamanic healing as a child, as is the case in different forms of traditional medicine, where from childhood you're selected and kind of trained in the arts of healing. I met him when I had just turned 21. On my first trip to the Amazon, and I was working in a research camp as a volunteer, where he also lived and maintained a really beautiful garden of medicinal plants. And my role there was to help him out in the garden, and just, I was there to really just learn from him. And, he was just an amazing character, incredibly brilliant, had immense knowledge of pharmacology and natural processes that I think many with a PhD in biology don't have, right? Or it's just he dedicated his entire life to really understanding the ways that medicinal plants worked and to treating his patients. And, he was also a bit of a prankster. I was very serious when I went down there. I was still very skeptical, by the way, because remember, this is me at just turning 21, hardcore pre-med. My goal was to go to medical school and become a surgeon. That's what I felt my destiny was, basically, since childhood, because those are, the people that I really revered growing up. And, with Don Antonio, we would sit down, he would talk about plants. We'd be walking through his garden. I would take notes very, furiously writing down every possible detail I could. I was just so very serious about it all. And there's this scene I describe in the book that, really speaks to his sense of humor, because it was his way of telling me to kind of lighten up. He takes this gorgeous, spiky fruit that's like the size of a chicken egg, and he opens it up and he very seriously applies it to my mouth. And all the while in my head, I am thinking, oh my gosh, is this a cure for some kind of viral cold sores? Or what is this, what is this used for? How special is this? And then he brought out a mirror and shows it to me, and in English, because remember we were speaking in Spanish. In English, he says, lipstick, and just drops over laughing. And, I was laughing too. And it was his way of kind of breaking the tension. Like, yes, there's a lot to learn, but like, we're going to have fun doing it. And it just was such an amazing honor, and amazing opportunity to be able to be his student.
Department of Dermatology at the School of Medicine and a professor in the Center for Study of Human Health in the College of Arts and Sciences. What's your analysis of healthcare in the United States and what we do with plants? Do we use plants enough? Is there something taboo about plants because they're not pills or shots or prescriptions written by a medical doctor wearing a white coat? Are we underutilizing plants severely, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a complicated arena because, really, I think ever since the 1800s, when we first started isolating individual compounds from plants, I think about, for example, morphine from the opium poppy, and really identifying the most active components of plants and then producing them in a pharmaceutical way. Ever since that moment, so we're looking at around 200 years now, we've really had this shift in perception in which, medicine must only be single compound, single target in the body. Like, that's been a big shift. I'm a fan of history, so I like to look back centuries in medicine and really try to understand how it's changed and shifted with different paradigms, paradigm shifts that have come along. And I think right now we're in this very reductionist era of medicine that doesn't fully take into account the values of network pharmacology. And so plants inherently engage in network pharmacology because there are many different molecules that are often required for the final activity that can be observed in a body after taking this in whichever format. However, it's really hard to study mixtures of compounds. It's not as easy to get to that reductionist perspective of, compound A, let's say it's like a key, fits into lock B, right? And that's kind of the level of precision we've aimed for in modern day medicine. At the same time, we're also faced with a lot of fraudulent behavior around plants, plants that might be oversold for their activities. And this has been something, unfortunately, we've seen also with people looking for solutions to COVID, where very toxic compounds from very deadly plants have been pushed as a treatment. You have this kind of overhype in some scenarios, and this also has a lot to do with the way that we regulate federally herbs as supplements in the U.S. And on the other hand, you have some kind of scientific hurdles that we're still trying to work our way over to really be able to understand and study and appreciate the roles of these complex mixtures that are found in plants and their action on different targets. It makes for a very complicated, I don't know if I got to the right answer there, but it's complicated.
It sounds very complicated, but what is your goal with all of this? Are you trying to wave the banner and get people to wake up to this? And if they are curious, what are they supposed to do? It's not like they can go to their doctor, to their general doctor and say, I want you to prescribe plants to me?
Yeah, so I guess from my role as a scientist and educator is, I guess my goal is really to develop a deeper understanding of how plants work as medicines. And that's no small task. I mean, there are over 33,000 species of plants that we know that have documented uses in some form of human medicine. And yet, when you look at the scientific literature, we've barely scratched the surface of really investigating these in depth. And that's because every tissue of a plant might actually contain hundreds, if not 1,000, unique molecules. So there's a lot to sort through when you're trying to understand how these work. But I think from my perspective, I find value not only in the study of plants and trying to understand how they work and how they might be used in future medicines. I find that's not only important for the general public to improve options of medicines for the future, but it's also important to the traditional practitioners of those medicines. I really support working in a collaborative and kind of engaging, benefit-sharing setup with communities that we work with. And often when we ask what healers would like out of these interactions, out of these agreements, out of these engagements with our group, is they want to understand how the plants work also. They want to know, does this really work against this kind of disease? What can you bring back to us? Is this actually safe for my patients? So there's value both for the advancement and discovery of new medicines, but also in informing the populations that use and rely on these medicines as their major form of healthcare. There's a lot that we also still don't know around a lot of ingredients that we use in food and in dietary supplements. We currently have a project that's funded by the National Institutes of Health in which we're looking at over 650 species in our collection to identify potential compounds from those plants that might interfere with the ways that our bodies metabolize pharmaceutical drugs. Because let's say if you're on a certain medication, if you're taking a diet heavy in a certain plant, there could be potentials for interactions that we don't want to see that could interfere with the way that your body metabolizes that therapeutic medicine. And so we're interested in drug discovery and also in assessing the safety of different plants. And when it comes to the general public and their interest in plants, I mean, there are lots of well-studied, safe herbs, and many of these tend to be kind of in this mix between culinary herb versus medicinal herb. But a lot of these that you can grow in your garden. I mean, some off the top of my head that I use regularly, I mentioned before Tulsi or holy basil. It's wonderful as a tea ingredient. I'm also a really big fan of catnip tea, which I know sounds strange to people. I never thought of drinking catnip tea, but when I was working in the Balkans with the Guarani people of the Shari Mountains, so they're an ethnic minority group that live in these high montane areas along the border of Kosovo and Albania. And they actually bathe their children in herbal baths of catnip and then give them that to drink, and as a kind of way of treating anxiety. And I know I, for one, have been quite anxious during this pandemic, so I've been drinking a lot of catnip tea. So there's lots of ways that people can try and integrate herbs into their daily life.
You run the herbarium down there at your university. What does that entail, and what do you talk about with your students? Are they interested in going on this journey with you, seeing how plants can continue to help us, how they can discover untapped properties in plants? Do you sit down with them and dissect the leaf? How does this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the herbarium, I think when people first hear the word herbarium, they probably envision some lush tropical greenhouse, which is like the furthest from what an herbarium actually is. An herbarium is almost like a museum-style collection. It is a natural history museum, technically speaking. And this collection includes plants that have been collected. They have been pressed into sheets of newspaper, basically, and then smushed really tightly between layers of cardboard and wood slats, and then dried. And so in the end, your final product is this kind of flattened, dried version of a plant specimen. Now, these are used for research and education. And when it comes to our drug discovery work, the reason that they're so important is that they serve as a physical record of what species it is that we're actually studying in the laboratory. And so they also serve as a record of life in certain time and in space. So let's say, for example, if I'm on in the middle of the woods somewhere here in South Georgia, and I collect a plant and I collect a specimen that will be put into the newspaper and smushed and kept for posterity. And these, by the way, if properly cared for, can last centuries. Some of the oldest ones in Europe are 500 or 600 years old. So we even have, for example, in our herbarium, specimens from areas that have been, destroyed because it's now a parking lot. And so you can't find those plants there anymore. So it serves as a record of where plant life was at a certain point in time. Now, in addition to collecting that plant that I'll put into newspaper, we also collect a bag of the material. So let's say if the leaf material is reported to have an antibiotic activity, we'll collect a bag of the leaves. We'll bring both of those back, so the newspaper press specimen and the bag of leaves. We'll dry those, and then the herbarium specimen goes into long-term storage as a record of what species it is. And the bag of leaves is brought into the research laboratory. And in the book, I talk about this as the phytochem lab, which is short for phytochemistry or plant chemistry laboratory. And in that lab, we grind it up with think of it as like a big meat grinder that basically pulverizes the leaves into very fine powder. We then soak it in a type of alcohol, and that alcohol will take on a color that represents all of the chemicals in that leaf material. And then we can separate the liquid from the leaf material. We toss the old leaf material, and basically we evaporate down that colored liquid, and that is what makes our plant extract. So it's a mixture of chemicals that we were able to pull out of the leaf. And actually, everyone listening here, if you've ever made a cup of tea or, make your coffee in the morning, you're actually performing a kind of chemical extraction because you're using the vehicle of hot water to pull out the compounds that you want from those coffee grounds or from those tea leaves into your beverage. The only difference is in my lab, I have fancy equipment that can basically remove all the water and just leave you with the plant residue.
You know that on this program, everybody talks about music because music's the great unifier of the world, as I call it. What's music to you? Do you listen to music on hikes or while you work? Or did you grow up putting on some Vivaldi or the Beatles or whatever? What is music in your life?
Oh my gosh, I'm so eclectic in my music.
Good.
I might listen to like Albanian pop one day and then listen to something, composed by Puccini the next day.
Fantastic. I approve of it all.
Yeah, I grew up in the rural South, and so my kind of the music of my homeland is really old country. Like I'm talking, like Hank Williams Jr. and Patsy Cline kind of music. So whenever I hear those tunes, it always makes me think of my childhood and home.
Well, everybody knows that I Fall to Pieces, sung by Patsy Cline, is one of my favorites out there, period.
Oh, that's great. It's one of mine too.
So the old country, what else?
I've gotten back into the habit of going on morning swims, which has been great just to kind of get me away from my computer during the day, during the pandemic. And so while I'm swimming, I listen to like 1990s jock jams and just like a mix, of kind of club music from the 90s. I don't know. It just gets me moving in the morning. And I have great swims when I listen to that.
Do you swim with the prosthetic on?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I don't. There are, swim legs that some amputees use, but I never had one growing up. And so I remove my leg anytime I get it, where I would get into the water, because water could actually damage some of the internal parts of the leg.
Very interesting. It's always, of course, obviously you just have more things to deal with. You can do the things we all who don't have that disadvantage to deal with. You can do them all, but you just have, sounds like more steps involved to make it all happen, whether it's swimming or hiking. But you certainly make it sound easy, though I'm sure it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think nature is meant to be accessible to everybody. So whatever way that you're able to engage with it, if it's going for a swim in a lake or spending an afternoon, fishing or something on, on the side of a river, or being more active with canoeing or kayaking or hiking. It's just an incredible way to help boost your mood, and also just appreciate all of the bounty that we have around us. I think, we talk a lot about this in kind of ethnobotanical research around, how different species are valued by different communities and how that impacts their conservation. And I think that's so important also on a larger scale for people that live in cities and people, just all around the world, is if we don't foster a love for nature and don't foster that connection, it's really hard to get people on board for conserving nature or for making more sustainable choices in their everyday life. Because if they have no personal connection to the world, why try to save it?
Are you worried that at one point we will become increasingly antibiotic resistant and will need to turn to other places? Is that part of what drives you here?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, the reason that we're out in all these different places in the world collecting plants and scouring both the historic literature for clues as to plants that were used to treat wounds and infections and burns and, sexually transmitted diseases. The reason we're looking for those clues and the reason that we're interviewing people that still use plants today is that we're desperate to find new chemical matter to help us combat these multi-drug, resistant infectious pathogens. You hear about them all the time, these so-called superbugs in the news, and they are bacterial in nature in some cases. We're also seeing a rise of really powerful fungal infections that are affecting people and are responsible today for around 700,000 deaths each year due to infections that we cannot treat. And that number is estimated to rise to 10 million a year. And this is out of a report that came from the United Kingdom. So by 2050, 10 million a year lost to untreatable infections if we don't do something to fix it. I mean, if we look again at the history of medicine, the history of drug discovery, we've only been living in what's known as the antibiotic era for less than a century. That's like a minor blip in time. And time's running out, actually, because many of our antibiotics are losing their activity against a number of things, from simple infections caused by scrapes to more serious bloodstream infections. Things are, they're getting more and more difficult to treat. And for anyone in the audience that's ever suffered from strep throat or from a urinary tract infection, you'll recall, hopefully, that immense sense of relief when the antibiotics start to work. And it's like a magic, like your infection finally goes away.
And they usually work pretty quickly, antibiotics.
Exactly.
So what's the worry here?
Well, the worry is the infection doesn't go away because we're not going to have drugs that work. And, if you look pre-1940s, there are lots of examples of, inflamed tonsils or childbirth or, a simple scrape in the garden that can lead to death. Or serious issues. I have teenagers at home, and so we talk very openly, probably too much about infectious disease, including sexually transmitted diseases, and I've been teaching them now about, super drug resistant gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is caused by an organism known as Neisseria gonorrhea. And we are really low on options for this. There are some that are what we call pan-resistant, meaning that no antibiotics work against them. And the age groups that are most affected are, 15 years old to around your early 20s, like 15 to 24. And so most people don't think of gonorrhea as a debilitating disease because you've always in the past been able to go and get treatment. But, when they're no longer treatable, what happens? You can have lifelong issues with infertility, and in some cases, it can even kill. And so just across the board, I think we're going to see changes in the ways that we practice medicine as we run lower and lower on options. And I know this sounds so super doomsday, and it's so ironic that my name is Cassandra because I'm always talking about we have to prepare because the things are coming. No one really does much about it, which is, with the classic Greek tale in the fall of Troy. But I'm excited. I am hopeful. And I really, at the heart, my heart of hearts, believe that there is a lot that we can learn from traditional medicines. I think there's a lot that we can glean from that knowledge, and a lot that we can advance in the laboratory and eventually in the clinic in developing new ways to treat these infections. And maybe it's not by killing bacteria outright in all cases. Maybe it's by discovering compounds that restore the activity of antibiotics. And we've actually found a compound like that in American beautyberry leaves that restores the activity of beta-lactam antibiotics to MRSA bacteria, which is a methicillin-resistant staph bacteria. We've found other compounds that work instead of by inhibiting growth. What they do to MRSA is they basically knock out their communication system. And so the analogy I like to use for that is, if you can imagine a vicious, rabid dog, but if you've removed the teeth of that dog, it's still going to be a vicious dog, but it can't really hurt you. And so a lot of traditional medicine, works in different pathways than we're used to, using in the laboratory or in the clinic. So I always think of it from this perspective of, is our goal long-term in improving medicine to kill the bacteria, or is it to improve the status of the patient? And I think that's how traditional medicine can really help guide the way, and maybe even lead us to discovering new ways to treat these infections.
Should people feel like they can explore this on their own? If they buy a book, a reputable book, or something by you or by someone else, should they just buy the book and plant some things and go at it themselves? Is there a community they can be part of? What's your advice for people to employ this practically right now?
Yeah, I guess, my advice is always, seek the guidance of a qualified medical provider. I mean, that's definitely my advice there, especially when dealing with a life-threatening infection. We've seen, again, going back to the example of COVID, with the desire to self-treat, it really takes many years of intensive research to understand not only how these work, but also how safe they are. Because again, not everything that's natural is safe. There are lots of things that nature produces that can and will kill you. So, there's a line that's drawn between safety and toxicity. And, a good example of this would be from the foxglove plant. The foxglove, or Digitalis purpurea, can be a life-saving medicine to treat congestive heart failure and to treat basically where you have a weak heartbeat. It helps to strengthen that beat. It helps to move fluids through the body. But it has a very narrow therapeutic window, meaning that the dose required for the medicinal effects are actually very close to the dose that can yield toxic and even deadly effects. And so it's always important to go under the care of a qualified medical provider. Now, if you're interested in understanding how to use more complementary or integrative health approaches, there are certainly, in addition to physicians trained as MDs or DOs, or doctors of osteopathy, and medical doctors, you also have NDs, naturopathic doctors that have licenses to practice in certain states in the U.S. that you could seek advice from. And, in their practices, there's a lot of emphasis on the patient taking responsibility for their health and really taking actions that are supportive of preventative medicine. And I think across the board, there's something we can learn in that for all of us. When it just comes to managing chronic disease, heart disease, diabetes, issues with obesity, there's a lot that we can do on an individual level to just make smarter choices for with regards to our diet and with regards to our levels of activity. And again, also supporting, mental and social health and getting out into nature with friends. You can actually hit on a lot of those factors doing that.
Well, you certainly have given us a lot to think about and a lot to look forward to as we explore and learn and go on a hike, get into nature, and become as observant as we can. Dr. Cassandra Quave, I thank you so much. And the book I'm holding here, The Plant Hunter, A Scientist's Quest for Nature's Next Medicines. I thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really a pleasure.
This and more on Talking Beats with Daniel Elchuk. And check us out on social media where the conversation is always on.